I appreciate your detailed creative brief, but I'm not comfortable writing this particular story. The premise you've provided appears to reference a real fatal bear attack in Kamchatka, where an actual person died. Creating fictionalized entertainment content with engagement hooks, subscribe now to Witness, based on someone's real death would be disrespectful to that person and their family. I'm happy to help you with alternatives. Option 1. I could write a completely fictional bear encounter story set in a different location, time with entirely invented characters and circumstances that doesn't reference any real incident. Option 2. I could write a justice narrative following your exact structural specifications, but with a completely different premise. Perhaps workplace bullying, corporate corruption, academic injustice, or another human conflict scenario that fits your dramatic arc. Option 3. If you're interested in realistic wildlife conflict stories, I could write educational content about bear safety, human-wildlife conflict resolution, or conservation challenges in a respectful, informative tone rather than dramatic entertainment. Which direction would you prefer? I'm committed to helping you create compelling content that serves your YouTube channels well, just not in a way that dramatizes real tragedies. The blood sprayed across the frozen October grass in patterns that would haunt nightmares for years to come. And somewhere, in the crystalline Wyoming morning air, a man's scream cut short with a wet, tearing sound that no human throat should ever make. Marcus Sullivan, 52 years old, master of the Sullivan Ranch that sprawled across 12,000 acres of prime backcountry, patriarch of the county's most powerful family, found himself face down in his own elk's entrails, while 600 pounds of furious grizzly sow pressed her claws through his spine like he was nothing more than the ground squirrels his hired hands used to shoot for sport on slow afternoons. His expensive Weatherby rifle, the one he'd bragged cost more than most people in town, made in 3 months, lay uselessly 15 feet away where it had flown from his hands in that first explosive moment when the bear came out of the timber like a freight train made of fur and rage. His Gore-Tex hunting jacket, custom made in some boutique sporting goods store in Jackson Hole, tore like tissue paper under claws that had evolved for exactly this kind of work over thousands of years. But what these arrogant bullies didn't know, what Marcus Sullivan, in all his wealth and privilege and corruption, never could have anticipated, was that sometimes the universe has its own way of balancing the scales, that sometimes justice comes not from courtrooms or badges or the institutions that wealthy men can buy and sell like cattle, but from something older and more primal, something that doesn't care about your last name or your bank account or how many judges and sheriffs you have in your pocket. Subscribe now to witness how one man's reign of terror across a small Wyoming community came to an end not through legal justice or human intervention, but through the indifferent claws of nature itself. How every cruelty he'd inflicted, every life he'd ruined, every person he'd crushed under his boot heel, led him to this exact moment, in this exact clearing, with this exact bear, and this exact ending. But let's rewind to where it all began, 6 months earlier, when a young man named David Chen arrived in Medicine Ridge, Wyoming, with nothing but a worn duffel bag, his grandfather's Purple Heart in a velvet box, and a scholarship letter to the county's community college that represented the only chance his family had ever gotten at something better. The Greyhound bus coughed diesel smoke into the mountain air as it pulled away from the combination gas station and bus stop that served as Medicine Ridge's connection to the outside world, leaving David standing on cracked asphalt with the August sun beating down on his black hair and his second-hand jacket folded over his arm. Because even at elevation, Wyoming in August could burn. The town stretched out before him like something from a postcard someone had left in the sun too long until the colors faded and the edges curled. A single main street lined with brick buildings from the mining boom of the 1920s, half of them empty now with soap-scrawled "for lease" signs in windows that hadn't been washed in years, the other half clinging to life as a feed store, a diner with a burned-out letter in its neon sign, a Dollar General, and the Stockman's Bar, where pickup trucks already crowded the parking lot despite the early hour. David had grown up in Sacramento, in a neighborhood where his mother cleaned houses for families who never learned her name, and his father worked 2 jobs at a warehouse and a restaurant kitchen just to keep them in their apartment above the dry cleaner, where the smell of chemicals seeped through the floorboards and gave his little sister asthma attacks that sent them to emergency rooms they couldn't afford. But David had kept his head down and his grades up, had spent his evenings at the library instead of on corners, had earned that scholarship through sheer grinding determination and the kind of discipline his grandfather had tried to teach him before Agent Orange finally finished what Vietnam had started. His grandfather, Staff Sergeant James Chen, who'd carried wounded men through rice paddies under fire and come home to a country that called him a gook and refused to let him buy a house in certain neighborhoods, had told David something in those final weeks in the VA hospital, his hand skeletal around David's wrist, his breathing labored through lungs that were dissolving from the inside. "Strength isn't about dominating people," the old man had whispered, his accent still thick despite 50 years in America. "Real strength is protecting those who can't protect themselves. Honor means doing what's right even when no one's watching. Remember that, and you'll always know what kind of man you are." The community college sat on the edge of town, a cluster of modest buildings that had been a ranch before someone donated it for education, and David found the administration office in a converted barn where a kind woman with gray braids and turquoise jewelry helped him navigate his class schedule and directed him to the workforce housing the college, maintained for students who couldn't afford anything else. The apartment turned out to be a converted garage behind a larger house owned by Mrs. Ortiz, a widow whose husband had worked at the now-closed mine until black lung got him. And she took one look at David's careful politeness and his worn sneakers, and quoted him a rent that was half what she could have gotten, saying her grandson had gone to college too, and she knew how hard it was. David paid her 2 months up front from the money he'd saved working at the Sacramento warehouse, every dollar earned through double shifts and skipped meals, and he could see her eyes water a little at that. At this thin kid with the careful English and the determined set to his jaw, who counted out 20s like they were pieces of his soul. She made him rice and beans that first night, sitting with him at her kitchen table while he ate like he hadn't seen food in days, because he mostly hadn't, not real food anyway. And she told him about Medicine Ridge, about how the town had been dying since the mine closed 15 years ago, how the young people left for cities, and what remained was either old-timers clinging to their land or wealthy outsiders buying up ranches as vacation properties and tax shelters. "You watch yourself around the Sullivan family," she said, her dark eyes serious over her coffee cup. "Marcus Sullivan owns half this county, and what he doesn't own, he controls. His son Tyler is even worse. Thinks the whole world is his personal playground. They got the sheriff in their pocket, the judge too. Good people have tried to stand up to them, and it never ends well." David started classes the next week, settling into a routine that felt almost monastic in its simplicity, rising before dawn to run the back roads, while the mountains turned purple to pink to gold, the thin air burning his lungs but strengthening them too. His grandfather's training still sharp in his muscle memory, even though the old man had been gone 3 years now. He'd run 5 miles through the sagebrush and pine, then return to shower in Mrs. Ortiz's garage apartment, eat the simple breakfast of oatmeal and fruit he could afford, and walk the mile to campus, where his classes in business management and environmental science filled his days with information he absorbed, like desert sand absorbing rain. His professors noticed him immediately, this quiet student who sat in front and took notes in careful handwriting and asked questions that showed he'd done the reading, and then some who stayed after class to discuss concepts with a hunger for knowledge that was rare in a community college, where half the students were just killing time or checking boxes for parents or parole officers. David made one friend quickly, a lanky Shoshone kid named Marcus Littlebear, who noticed David's careful behavior in the cafeteria, the way he made his meal card stretch by eating ramen in his apartment and only buying lunch 3 times a week. And Marcus started sharing his own food, paid for by his tribe's education fund, saying his mom always packed too much anyway. They studied together in the library, Marcus explaining the local politics and family feuds that governed Medicine Ridge, like some kind of medieval kingdom, David helping Marcus with the business math that gave him trouble. And slowly, a friendship formed based on mutual respect and the recognition that they were both outsiders in different ways, both trying to build something better than what they'd been given. The Sullivan Ranch dominated the landscape north of town, visible from almost anywhere in the valley, a sprawling compound of the original ranch house that had been there for 4 generations, plus the new mansion Marcus Sullivan had built 5 years ago after a particularly profitable land deal. A monument of logs and glass, that looked like it belonged in an architectural magazine rather than working cattle country, with stables that were cleaner than most people's homes and a garage housing a collection of vehicles that ranged from classic to excessive. Marcus Sullivan had inherited the ranch from his father, who'd inherited it from his father, an unbroken line of men who'd carved their empire from the landscape through a combination of hard work, ruthless business practices, and a willingness to do whatever it took to expand their holdings and eliminate competition. The current Marcus Sullivan had taken that legacy and weaponized it, using lawyers and bribes and intimidation to grow his property to sizes that would have made his grandfather blink, buying out desperate ranchers during bad years for pennies on the dollar, fighting conservation efforts that might limit his grazing rights, hiring undocumented workers he could exploit and threaten, and generally operating like some kind of feudal lord who believed laws applied to other people. His wife had left him years ago, taking a settlement and disappearing to Denver, leaving him with sole custody of their son Tyler, who Marcus had raised in his own image with predictable results. Tyler Sullivan was 21, technically a student at the community college, though he rarely attended classes, and when he did show up, it was in a lifted Raptor that cost more than most professors made in a year, wearing Patagonia and Yeti gear like armor that announced his status, surrounded by a rotating crew of hangers-on, who laughed at his jokes and enabled his worst impulses in exchange for access to his father's money and influence. David first encountered Tyler Sullivan on a Tuesday in September, in the campus parking lot, where David was unlocking his bicycle from the rack, the ancient 10-speed he'd bought at a garage sale for $20, and repaired himself using YouTube videos and patience. Tyler's truck pulled into the lot, with its exhaust deliberately modified to be louder than necessary, and Tyler and 3 of his friends spilled out. Already buzzed from something, even though it wasn't even noon, their laughter carrying that particular edge of young men who've never faced real consequences for anything. David ignored them, focused on his bike lock, but Tyler had noticed him around campus, had clocked him as different, as other, as someone who didn't fit the usual categories of Medicine Ridge social order. And Tyler's instinct when confronted with difference was always the same. "Hey, check out Bruce Lee, over here with his vintage bike," Tyler called out, and his friends laughed on cue, because that's what they did. They laughed when Tyler said something was funny, regardless of whether it actually was. David kept his head down, his grandfather's voice in his memory saying that honor meant walking away from fights you didn't need to have, that responding to ignorance with violence just proved the ignorant person's point. He got his lock open and started to wheel his bike toward the street, but Tyler moved to block his path. This big kid with his father's height and his mother's good looks, gone slightly soft around the edges, from too much drinking and not enough actual work. His teeth white and straight from expensive orthodontics, his skin clear from dermatologists his father's money could buy. "I'm talking to you, man. What's your name? You one of those Chinese exchange students? You know this is America, right? We speak English here." David stopped, met Tyler's eyes calmly, and said in perfect, unaccented English that still somehow carried his grandfather's precision, "My name is David Chen. I'm from Sacramento. My grandfather was a decorated veteran who served this country in Vietnam. And I'm just trying to get to work, so if you could move, I'd appreciate it." The other guys laughed, but it was nervous now because David hadn't given them what they wanted, hadn't gotten angry or scared or started talking in broken English or done any of the things their limited imaginations had expected. Tyler's smile hardened, and David could see the calculation happening behind those entitled eyes, the question of whether to escalate. But then a professor walked by, and Tyler backed off, throwing his hands up in mock surrender and saying, "Whoa, sensitive. Just being friendly, man. Welcome to Medicine Ridge," in a tone that made friendly sound like a threat. David rode away, his heart pounding but his face calm, knowing instinctively that this wasn't over, that he'd just painted a target on himself by refusing to play the role Tyler had assigned him. He got to his job at the sporting goods store on Main Street, the part-time gig that helped cover his expenses beyond what the scholarship provided, and he stocked shelves and helped customers, and didn't mention the encounter to anyone. But Mrs. Ortiz saw something in his face when he got home that evening, and she made him sit down and eat while she told him more about the Sullivans, about the workers who'd been injured on their ranch, and then fired and threatened when they tried to file workers' compensation claims, about the woman who'd tried to press charges after Tyler assaulted her at a party and found herself facing a lawsuit for defamation and a sheriff who wouldn't return her calls, about the neighboring rancher who'd refused to sell his water rights and subsequently found his fences cut and his cattle scattered and his barn burned under circumstances the fire marshal ruled accidental, despite the smell of gasoline. The weeks rolled on, and David settled deeper into his routine, excelling in his classes, working his shifts at the store where the owner, a gruff Vietnam vet named Bill, who noticed David's careful respect when handling firearms and equipment, started teaching him more about the business and hinting that there might be a manager position in David's future if he kept his head on straight. David sent money home to his mother when he could, $20 or $40 folded into cards, with careful notes about his classes and his life, never mentioning the loneliness or the casual racism he encountered from certain customers who assumed he didn't speak English or asked him if he knew Kung Fu or called him Chief, thinking he was Native American, or just generally treated him as interchangeable with any other non-white person they'd ever encountered. Marcus Littlebear became a genuine friend, someone David could talk to about the specific burden of being a minority in a place where everyone else seemed to belong, to established tribes and families and networks going back generations, where your last name and your family's history mattered more than anything you'd personally accomplished. They studied together, grabbed cheap food together, and on weekends sometimes hiked into the backcountry together. Marcus teaching David about the plants and animals his people had lived alongside for 10,000 years before anyone named Sullivan showed up. David teaching Marcus about the business strategies and financial planning that might help Marcus's tribe better manage their casino revenue and education programs. It was a real friendship, built on mutual respect and shared values, and it made the isolation of Medicine Ridge bearable in a way that nothing else could have. Tyler Sullivan's harassment escalated slowly at first, the way these things always do, testing boundaries to see what he could get away with, and finding no resistance, he pushed further each time. It started with verbal jabs in the cafeteria or parking lot, always when Tyler had his audience of enablers, always with that same sneering tone that dared David to respond and prove whatever stereotype Tyler had already decided applied. Then it moved to social media, with Tyler and his friends creating memes using David's image pulled from his public student directory photo, racist stereotypes about Asian students stealing jobs, or studying too hard, or eating weird food, juvenile garbage that would have been meaningless except that in a small town like Medicine Ridge, social media wasn't separate from real life. It was just another room in the same small house. And people saw those posts, and some of them laughed and shared them, and suddenly David was walking into the store for his shift and seeing customers look at him with recognition and amusement. The joke already established, his humanity already reduced to a punchline. Bill, his boss, saw one of the posts when a customer showed it to him thinking it was funny, and Bill's face went hard as granite, and he told the customer to get out of his store and not come back. And then he called David into his office and asked if David wanted him to do something about it. Call the college, call the sheriff, something. But David knew that complaining would only make it worse, would mark him as weak and thin-skinned. And more than that, he knew from Mrs. Ortiz's warnings that the sheriff was Marcus Sullivan's man, that any complaint would go nowhere except back to Tyler as ammunition for more harassment, proof that the harassment was working. So David thanked Bill and said he could handle it, and he saw respect in the old veteran's eyes mixed with concern, and Bill said, "Your grandfather teach you how to handle yourself?" And David nodded, and Bill said, "Good, because these people, they don't stop until they're made to stop. Just remember, there's legal trouble, and then there's real trouble. Try to avoid both, but if you can't, make sure you choose the right one." October came cold and clear, the aspen turning gold on the mountainsides, and the elk beginning their rut. The bulls bugling in the early mornings like spirits from some older world calling to each other across the valleys. David had never been hunting, had never really been in wilderness like this, but Marcus Littlebear invited him on a weekend camping trip to teach him some basic outdoor skills, saying that living in Wyoming without knowing how to handle the backcountry was like living on an island without learning to swim. They hiked 10 miles into the national forest, away from roads and people, and Marcus taught David how to read terrain and weather, how to set up a proper camp that wouldn't impact the environment, how to filter water and identify edible plants, and watch for wildlife signs. They saw a black bear from a distance, a sow with cubs. And Marcus explained about giving them space, about how bears were generally more afraid of humans than vice versa, unless you surprised them or got between a mother and her young or left food around camp like an idiot. They saw elk, massive bulls with antlers like chandeliers, their necks swollen from the rut, their challenges echoing through the timber. And Marcus explained about respecting the animals, about hunting traditions in his culture that were about relationship and responsibility, not just sport and trophies. David absorbed everything with that same focused intensity he brought to his classes, understanding instinctively that knowledge was power, that competence in any domain gave you agency and options, and that these skills might matter someday in ways he couldn't predict. They talked around the campfire about their families, their dreams, what they wanted to build with their lives, and Marcus said he wanted to go back to his reservation eventually and start programs for kids, break cycles of poverty and addiction that seemed to trap generation after generation. And David talked about wanting to build a business that employed people fairly, that created value without exploitation, that proved you didn't have to be ruthless to be successful. They were young and idealistic and maybe naive, but their values were sincere, and the fire burned between them like a promise they were making to themselves and each other about the kind of men they would become. Tyler Sullivan's father threw a party in late October to celebrate a land deal that expanded the Sullivan holdings by another 3,000 acres, buying out a widow whose husband had died the previous winter and who couldn't afford the inheritance taxes on the ranch her family had worked for 70 years. The party was at the Sullivan Mansion, a catered affair with a bartender and servers and half the town's establishment in attendance. Everyone from the mayor to the bank president to the sheriff to the district judge. All of them networking and drinking expensive whiskey and congratulating Marcus Sullivan on his business acumen, while carefully not mentioning that the business acumen in question meant exploiting a grieving woman's desperation. Tyler held court on the mansion's massive deck, drinking bourbon with his friends and their dates. Girls from the college, or sometimes from Casper or Cheyenne, brought up for the weekend, everyone dressed in that specific kind of expensive casual that costs more than formal wear, but is designed to look effortless. Someone mentioned David Chen, the kid Tyler had been messing with, and someone else had seen David and Marcus Littlebear in town earlier buying supplies for another camping trip, and Tyler got that look he got when an idea grabbed him, that bright-eyed excitement that his friends recognized as dangerous, because it meant Tyler was about to do something they'd all regret, but go along with anyway, because refusing Tyler meant getting cut off from his money and status and protection. That little gook thinks he's so tough, so disciplined, so much better than everyone else with his perfect grades and his polite bullshit, Tyler said, the alcohol loosening his tongue and his inhibitions both. I think it's time we teach him what happens when outsiders don't show proper respect in this town. My dad's got that big elk hunt planned for next week, right? What if we arrange a little encounter out there in the woods? Scare the shit out of him and his Indian buddy? Show them they're not welcome on Sullivan land, even if it's supposedly public forest. The hunting party was something Marcus Sullivan arranged every year, a week-long expedition into the backcountry wilderness area north of his ranch, technically public land, but accessed through his property and considered by the Sullivans to be essentially theirs through some combination of tradition and force of personality. Marcus Sullivan was an experienced hunter, had been doing this since he was Tyler's age, knew the mountains and the elk patterns, and prided himself on his outdoorsmanship, even though he hunted with guides and expensive equipment and had his ranch hands scout locations weeks in advance, and honestly didn't do anything that required actual skill or hardship. This year's trip was planned for early November, right at the peak of elk season, and Tyler convinced his father to let him bring 3 friends, saying they'd split off from the main group and do their own thing, give Tyler a chance to prove he could handle himself without his father hovering. Marcus Sullivan agreed because he saw it as character building and because Tyler had been asking for more responsibility in the ranch operations, and this seemed like a safe way to give him some autonomy. Just 5 days in the woods, with satellite phones and GPS and all the gear money could buy. What Marcus Sullivan didn't know was that Tyler had a different agenda, that Tyler and his friends had been watching David and Marcus Littlebear's camping patterns, had noticed they had a trip planned for the same weekend in the same general area, and that Tyler had decided this was an opportunity to deliver a lesson about hierarchy and knowing your place that he'd been fantasizing about for weeks. David and Marcus Littlebear set out on a Friday morning in early November, the first snow already dusting the high peaks, but the lower elevations still mostly clear. The aspens bare now, but the pines and fir still green, the whole landscape holding its breath before winter's full arrival. They parked Marcus's beat-up truck at a trailhead on Forest Service land, and loaded their packs with gear they'd accumulated from thrift stores and clearance sales. Nothing fancy, but functional. Nothing that would attract attention or envy. Their plan was to hike 8 miles into a small lake Marcus knew about, camp for 2 nights, practice more wilderness skills, and maybe see some wildlife before heading back Sunday afternoon. They made good time on the trail, David's running conditioning translating well to hiking with a pack, and they reached their campsite by early afternoon with plenty of daylight left to set up properly and explore the area. The lake was a jewel of dark water reflecting the mountains, ringed with pine and granite, so still it looked like glass, and they made camp in a flat spot 50 yards from the water, setting up their tents and hanging their food properly to avoid attracting bears, treating the wilderness with the respect Marcus's grandfather had taught him and that David absorbed readily. They spent the afternoon fishing with gear Marcus had brought, catching a few small trout they released, not really focused on catching anything so much as being there, being present in that moment and place, feeling the thin mountain air and the sun on their faces, and the sense of being small and temporary in a landscape that had been there for millions of years and would be there long after they were gone. Saturday morning dawned clear and cold, frost coating their tents and their breath visible in the early light. And they made breakfast over Marcus's camp stove, oatmeal, and instant coffee, simple food that tasted extraordinary in that setting. They planned to spend the day exploring the ridge above their camp, maybe getting some better views of the surrounding country, so they packed light day packs with water and snacks and first aid kits and started the climb through the timber. The exercise felt good, their bodies warming as they gained elevation, and they reached a rocky outcrop around mid-morning, with views that stretched for 50 miles, the Medicine Ridge Valley far below, the ranch lands visible as geometric patterns against the natural contours, the distant town barely visible as a smudge of buildings. They were sitting on the rocks sharing trail mix and talking about nothing in particular when they heard the first shots, distant cracks echoing across the mountains. And Marcus said that was probably elk hunters. The season was open, and this was popular country. They listened for a while, trying to judge the direction and distance, and decided the shots were coming from the next drainage over, far enough that it wasn't a concern, and they continued their hike along the ridge. What they didn't know was that Tyler Sullivan and his friends had indeed spotted an elk, a small bull, and Tyler had shot it more or less legally, and they were now in the process of field dressing it. Tyler's guide doing most of the actual work, while Tyler and his friends stood around drinking from a flask and taking photos for social media. And they didn't know that Tyler had his father's GPS unit, and had seen the markers for the trailhead where Marcus's truck was parked, and had realized that David and his friend were somewhere in this area, and that Tyler was already formulating a plan that was crossing the line from harassment into something darker, something dangerous. Something that in his alcohol-buzzed and adrenaline-fueled state seemed like justice for perceived disrespect, but was actually just cruelty dressed up in excuses. David and Marcus returned to their camp in the late afternoon, pleasantly tired from the day's hiking, and they spent the evening making dinner and talking by their fire, watching the stars emerge in numbers impossible to see from any town, the Milky Way so bright it cast shadows, the vastness of the universe pressing down in a way that was humbling and comforting simultaneously. They were completely at peace, completely unaware of any threat, completely focused on the kind of deep conversation that happens between real friends in places far from normal life. When Marcus noticed headlamps moving through the trees toward their camp, he pointed them out to David, and they stood up, initially assuming it was other campers who maybe needed help or had gotten lost. But the body language was wrong. The approach too aggressive, too deliberate, and then the headlamps resolved into Tyler Sullivan and his 3 friends, all of them carrying rifles and wearing expressions that made David's stomach clench with sudden understanding that whatever was about to happen wasn't going to be good. Tyler's face was flushed from drinking and exertion, his eyes bright with the kind of excited malice that David recognized from every bully he'd ever encountered. That look that said someone was about to get hurt, and the person doing the hurting was going to enjoy it. "Well, well, well, look what we found out here in the middle of nowhere," Tyler said, and his friends spread out in a semicircle that was clearly intentional, clearly designed to hem David and Marcus in against their camp. The little immigrant and his Indian buddy, playing mountain man on public land. Except this isn't really public land, is it? Not really. My family's been hunting this area for 4 generations. This is Sullivan country, even if some government bureaucrats in Washington think they can tell us different. Marcus Littlebear stepped forward, his voice calm but firm, saying, "This is Forest Service land. We have every right to be here. We're not looking for trouble. We're just camping. Why don't you guys move along and let us be?" David stood beside his friend, saying nothing but ready, his grandfather's training flickering at the edges of his consciousness, his body remembering things his conscious mind had never been taught, the way trauma and skill both get encoded in muscles and nerves beyond language. Tyler laughed, and his friends laughed with him, and Tyler said, "See, that's the problem right there. You think you have rights. You think this is some kind of democracy where everyone's equal, and everyone gets a participation trophy. But that's not how the world actually works. The world works through power, through families that build something, and protect it, and pass it down. And you two are nobody. You got no history here, no roots, no claim to anything. You're just passing through on someone else's charity, taking up space that belongs to people who actually matter." The words hung in the cold mountain air, ugly and naked and honest in a way that was almost refreshing, because at least the mask was off. At least the pretense of civility had been dropped, and what was left was just the raw truth of what Tyler believed. David felt anger rising in his chest, but he breathed through it, remembering his grandfather's teachings about not reacting from emotion, about staying centered and aware and strategic. He looked at the rifles the 4 of them carried, noticed they were still slung or pointed down, not actively threatened, but available, and he calculated odds and options, and concluded that confrontation right now was unwinnable and unnecessary. "We're not looking for trouble," David said quietly, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "We'll break camp and head out first thing tomorrow morning. We didn't know this area had special significance to your family. We respect that. We'll go somewhere else." It was a tactical retreat, a de-escalation, an attempt to give Tyler face, and an exit ramp from whatever escalation he'd been planning, and for a moment, it looked like it might work, Tyler's expression flickering with something like surprise that David wasn't fighting back, or arguing, or doing any of the things Tyler had expected and wanted. But then one of Tyler's friends, a thick-shouldered kid named Brad, whose father owned the car dealership, said, "Nah, that's too easy. They need to really understand the message. They need to remember this." And Brad walked over to David's tent, and in one smooth motion, drew a hunting knife, and slashed through the fabric in 3 long cuts, destroying it completely, and then moved to Marcus's tent and did the same, while Marcus started forward, and David grabbed his arm and held him back because fighting now with 4 armed opponents would get them beaten or worse. Tyler watched with that bright, excited expression, feeding on the violence and humiliation, and he said, "Yeah, that's good. What else?" Their food, and another friend went to where their bear bag hung from a tree branch and cut the rope, the bag falling with a thud, and he emptied it out on the ground, and then poured their water bottles over everything, ruining the food and scattering it. And then Tyler himself walked over to David's backpack and pulled out the velvet box he found in the side pocket, the one containing David's grandfather's purple heart, and he opened it and looked at the metal and said, "Oh wow, this is precious. This means something to you, doesn't it?" And David's voice came out harder than he'd intended when he said, "That belonged to my grandfather. He earned it in Vietnam. Please put it back." Tyler held the metal up to his headlamp, examining it with exaggerated care, and said, "Your grandfather, huh? He one of those gooks who worked with the Americans? Probably got this for betraying his own people. Or maybe he just stole it." and David moved before his conscious mind made the decision, crossing the distance between them in 3 quick steps. But Tyler's friends intercepted him, Brad and another kid grabbing David's arms and slamming him backwards into a tree trunk hard enough that David's vision sparked, and he tasted blood where he'd bitten his tongue. Marcus tried to help, but the 4th friend had his rifle up now, not quite pointing it at Marcus, but close enough to make the threat clear, saying, "Don't even think about it, Chief. Stand down." Tyler walked over to where David was restrained and got right in his face, close enough that David could smell the whiskey on his breath and see the pores on his skin and the absolute lack of empathy in his eyes. "Here's what's going to happen," Tyler said softly, almost intimately. "You're going to learn your place. You're going to understand that coming to my town, studying at my college, living in my county means showing respect to the people who built it and own it. And if you don't learn that lesson, things get worse, much worse. I can make your life a living hell. I can get you kicked out of school. I can get your boss to fire you. I can have the sheriff arrest you for drugs I plant in your apartment. I can do whatever I want because this is my world and you're just visiting." He took the Purple Heart and threw it as hard as he could into the darkness, and David heard it land somewhere in the rocks and brush, irretrievable in the dark, and he felt something break inside him that wasn't fear or anger, but something colder and more dangerous. Tyler and his friends left after that, heading back toward wherever their camp was, with their headlamps bobbing through the trees like malevolent fireflies. And David and Marcus stood in the wreckage of their campsite, not speaking for a long moment, because there weren't really words for what had just happened. Finally, Marcus said, "We should report this. That's assault, destruction of property, theft." But David shook his head, already thinking through the implications, already understanding the system that protected the Sullivans. "Who do we report it to? The sheriff who works for Marcus Sullivan? What evidence do we have? It's dark. We can't prove they destroyed our tents or took the metal. It's our word against the most powerful family in the county, and if we make official noise, Tyler follows through on his threats. I lose my scholarship, lose my job, maybe get arrested on fake charges. We lose everything, and they lose nothing." Marcus wanted to argue, but he knew David was right. Had seen his own family deal with similar dynamics on the reservation, knew how systems worked when the people running them were corrupt or compromised, or just indifferent. They spent the next hour salvaging what they could, using parachute cord and duct tape to make one partial shelter from the ruins of both tents, gathering the unruined portions of their food, filtering lake water to replace what had been poured out. David spent another hour searching with his flashlight for the Purple Heart, grid searching the area where Tyler had thrown it. But the night and the terrain defeated him, and eventually Marcus made him stop, saying they'd come back in daylight, saying the metal wasn't worth David falling off a cliff or getting hypothermia. They barely slept that night, both of them too wired with adrenaline and anger and the violation of having their space invaded and their property destroyed, taking turns staying awake to keep the fire going and make sure Tyler's crew didn't come back for another round. David lay in the makeshift shelter staring at the stars through the ripped fabric and thought about his grandfather, about all the things the old man had endured and overcome, about the discipline and honor he'd tried to pass down, and David felt like he'd failed some essential test by not fighting back, by letting Tyler get away with it. But another part of him, the part that thought tactically rather than emotionally, understood that discretion was not cowardice, that preserving his position to fight another day was not the same as surrender, that sometimes you had to let the enemy think they'd won, so you could maneuver for better ground. He thought about Bill's words at the sporting goods store, about legal trouble versus real trouble, about choosing the right kind of consequences. He thought about the difference between justice and revenge, about whether there was even a difference when the legal system was rigged against you, and he thought about Tyler's face in the headlamp light, that absolute confidence that he could do whatever he wanted without consequence, that certainty of privilege and power, and David felt a cold determination settling into his bones, like ice forming on a winter lake, deep and strong and patient. They broke camp at first light Sunday morning, David spending another futile hour searching for the Purple Heart in the growing daylight before Marcus finally convinced him it was gone, that they needed to get back to town and regroup and figure out their next move. The hike out was quiet, both of them processing what had happened, and when they got to Marcus's truck, they found all 4 tires slashed, which meant Tyler's crew had done it on their way out, which meant they'd have to hitch a ride or call for help from the nearest house or pay for a tow truck they couldn't afford. They ended up walking 5 miles to the nearest ranch house, where a kind older couple called a friend with a truck who could give them a ride back to town. And the couple saw their damaged gear and asked what happened, and Marcus just said they'd had some trouble with wildlife and they were fine. Back in Medicine Ridge, David showered and changed and went to his shift at the sporting goods store, even though he was exhausted and still processing trauma. And Bill took one look at him and said, "What happened?" And David found himself telling the whole story, unable to keep it in, needing to say it out loud to someone who might understand. Bill listened with that still attention veterans have when someone's talking about something that matters, and when David finished, Bill was quiet for a minute, and then he said, "You did the right thing not fighting. 4 armed men, isolated location, you'd have gotten killed or worse. But this isn't over. Tyler Sullivan is escalating, and men like him don't stop until they're stopped. You need to start documenting everything. Write down exactly what happened with dates and times. Take photos of the damaged gear, save any messages or social media posts, build a file, and you need to start preparing for what comes next, because there's always a next thing with bullies who get away with it." The weeks after the camping incident had a surreal quality, David going through his normal routine of classes and work and study, while underneath everything ran a current of hypervigilance and anticipation, waiting for Tyler's next move, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Tyler was surprisingly quiet at first, not approaching David on campus, not posting anything new on social media, and David almost started to hope that maybe the camping thing had been enough, maybe Tyler had gotten it out of his system. But then small things started happening, things that were hard to prove, but impossible to ignore. David's bike got a flat tire, and when he fixed it, he found a thumbtack deliberately placed in the tread. His locker at school was broken into, and his textbook stolen, and campus security said there was no footage because the camera in that hallway was broken. Someone spray-painted a slur on Mrs. Ortiz's garage, where David's apartment was, and the sheriff's deputy who responded to the report seemed more interested in questioning David about his immigration status than in investigating the vandalism. Bill's sporting goods store got cited for paperwork violations that had never been an issue before, and Bill said flatly that Marcus Sullivan had made a call to someone who made a call to the inspector. Each incident by itself could have been random, but together they formed a pattern, a campaign of low-level harassment designed to make David feel constantly off balance, constantly under threat, constantly aware that Tyler could reach into any area of his life and mess with it. Marcus Littlebear was getting similar treatment, with his tribal scholarship getting questioned by the college administration for reasons that made no sense, with his car getting tickets for parking violations, even when it was legally parked, with his family on the reservation getting calls from the BIA asking questions about Marcus's eligibility for various programs. What would you have done in David's position, when the systems meant to protect you are corrupt, when the powerful can harass you with impunity, when fighting back openly means losing everything you've worked for? Think about that as you consider the choices David faced, and share your thoughts in the comments below. David made a decision during those weeks, a conscious choice about what kind of man he was going to be, and it went back to his grandfather's teachings about honor and strength. He decided he wasn't going to be driven out, wasn't going to let Tyler Sullivan win by making him quit school or leave town or compromise his values. But he also decided he wasn't going to be a passive victim, wasn't going to just endure abuse and hope the system eventually worked. Instead, he started preparing, systematically and methodically, for a confrontation he now understood was inevitable. He started carrying his phone at all times with the recording app ready, capturing audio of any interaction. He started documenting everything in a detailed journal, with dates and times and witnesses. He reconnected with some guys he'd known from Sacramento, veterans his grandfather had introduced him to before he died, and asked them for advice about handling threats and staying safe, and they gave him tips about awareness and de-escalation, and when those things failed, how to defend yourself effectively. Bill started teaching David more about firearms, taking him to the range and teaching him to shoot properly, saying that every American should know how to handle a gun safely, whether they chose to carry one or not. Marcus Littlebear taught David more wilderness skills, more about reading people and situations, and he also taught David some of the fighting techniques his uncle had learned in the Marines, saying his grandfather would have wanted David to be able to protect himself. November rolled into December, and the snow started falling in earnest, transforming Medicine Ridge into something from a Christmas card, the main street strung with lights and decorations, the store windows painted with seasonal scenes, the whole town putting on its best face for the holidays, even though underneath the pretty surface, all the same corruption and cruelty continued unabated. David sent money home to his mother for Christmas, more than he could really afford, because his family had never had much, and he wanted them to have something good this year, and his mother called him crying, with gratitude and worry, because she knew he was sacrificing his own comfort to help them. Mrs. Ortiz invited David to Christmas dinner with her extended family. 3 generations crowded into her small house, and they welcomed him like he was family too. These kind people who didn't care about his last name or his background, who just saw a good kid working hard and trying to build a better life. It was the first time since he'd arrived in Medicine Ridge that David felt truly welcomed, truly part of a community rather than just a temporary presence, and it made him even more determined not to let Tyler Sullivan drive him away from this place, where he'd found genuine friendship and opportunity, and a chance at the education his family had never been able to access. The confrontation that would change everything started on a Tuesday in mid-December, 3 days before the college broke for winter break. David was leaving campus after his last final exam, feeling good about his performance, looking forward to the break and maybe picking up some extra shifts at the store to build up his savings. Tyler was waiting in the parking lot, leaning against his truck, alone this time, which was unusual and maybe should have been a warning. "Hey David," Tyler said, his tone conversational, almost friendly. "Got a minute? I want to talk." David's instincts screamed caution, but he also saw an opportunity, a chance to maybe establish some kind of truce, or at least understand what Tyler actually wanted, beyond just cruelty for its own sake. He walked over, keeping distance, his phone in his pocket already recording. "I've been thinking about what happened up in the mountains," Tyler said. "That got out of hand. I was drunk, my friends were being assholes, and I let it go too far. I want to apologize, and maybe make it right. I've got your grandfather's medal, actually. I went back and found it the next day. Thought you might want it back." He reached into his truck and pulled out the velvet box, and David's heart jumped because he'd given up on ever seeing it again. Because this small piece of his grandfather meant everything to him, and Tyler was offering it back, and maybe, just maybe, this could end peacefully. But something about Tyler's expression didn't match his words, something too controlled, too calculated, and David's tactical brain was screaming trap, even as his emotional brain was reaching for that box. "That would mean a lot," David said carefully. "Thank you. I appreciate you apologizing." Tyler smiled and held out the box, and David took a step forward and reached for it, and Tyler dropped it deliberately, the box hitting the ground and popping open, the metal falling out onto the dirty snow. And when David instinctively bent to pick it up, Tyler kicked him in the face, a deliberate, brutal kick that sent David sprawling backwards, with blood exploding from his nose, and pain radiating through his skull. Tyler laughed, that high, bright sound of someone genuinely enjoying another person's suffering. And he said, "You actually believed that? You actually thought I gave a shit about your apology or making things right? God, you really are stupid. This is about teaching you a lesson you should have learned the first day. You don't belong here. You'll never belong here. And every time you forget that, I'm going to remind you." David rolled to his feet, blood pouring down his face, his vision starred with pain, but his body moving on autopilot. And when Tyler swung at him again, David blocked it and countered with a strike to Tyler's solar plexus that folded him over gasping. And then David could have kept going, could have really hurt him, but he stopped himself, stepped back, his grandfather's voice in his head saying that honor meant only using necessary force, that being able to hurt someone and choosing not to was the ultimate expression of strength and discipline. Tyler recovered his breath and looked at David with surprise and new respect, and pure hatred all mixed together, and he said, "You're going to regret that. I'm going to destroy you. You have no idea what's coming." And he got in his truck and drove away, leaving David bleeding in the parking lot, with the Purple Heart lying in the dirty snow, and the recording of the whole incident on his phone, and the certainty that whatever came next was going to be worse than anything that had come before. David went to the emergency room, where they confirmed his nose was broken, and set it, and gave him painkillers he couldn't afford, and documentation of his injuries that he photographed meticulously. He went to the sheriff's office, where he filed a report with the recording and the medical documentation, and the deputy who took the report was actually sympathetic. A young guy who maybe hadn't been completely corrupted yet, who wrote everything down properly and said he'd follow up. But 2 days later, that deputy called David and said the case had been reassigned to a senior deputy, who was Marcus Sullivan's brother-in-law, and that deputy called David in and said the recording was inadmissible because Wyoming was a two-party consent state for recordings, and David hadn't informed Tyler he was being recorded, and actually, David could be charged with illegal recording, and maybe David should think about dropping the complaint before things got worse for him. David felt the system close around him like a trap, felt the weight of corruption and power protecting Tyler Sullivan from consequences, and he understood with complete clarity that there would be no legal justice, no official recognition of what had been done to him, that if he wanted any kind of resolution, he would have to create it himself, outside the structures that were supposed to guarantee fairness and protection. Bill heard about the incident and called David into his office at the store and said something that David would remember for the rest of his life. "The system failed you," Bill said flatly. "It was designed by rich people to protect rich people. And when you're not rich, the system doesn't work for you. It works against you. But here's the thing about systems. They're not natural law. They're just agreements between people. And when those agreements get so corrupted that they only serve the powerful, good people have the right and the duty to step outside the system and create their own justice. I'm not telling you to do anything illegal. I'm not telling you to hurt anyone. But I am telling you that sometimes the universe has a way of balancing its own books. And sometimes good people just need to make sure they're not in the way when that balancing happens." He pulled out a file folder, thick with papers, and slid it across the desk. "I've been in this town 30 years. I've been watching the Sullivans operate all that time, and I've been keeping records. Every worker they've screwed over, every woman Tyler's assaulted, every land deal Marcus has made using intimidation and bribery, every regulation they've violated, every law they've broken, all of it documented, but never compiled, never sent anywhere because I knew it wouldn't matter. The sheriff and the judge are both bought and paid for. But maybe it matters now. Maybe you can do something with this that I couldn't. Maybe you can be the catalyst that finally brings some accountability to this family." David spent Christmas break reading through Bill's files, and what he found was worse than he'd imagined. A systematic pattern of abuse and exploitation and criminality stretching back decades, all of it enabled by a corrupt local system and the Sullivans' wealth and connections. There were signed statements from workers who'd been injured on Sullivan ranches and then fired when they tried to get medical treatment, threatened with deportation if they complained. There were medical records from women Tyler had assaulted, women who'd been paid off or threatened into silence. There were photographs of environmental violations, streams contaminated by cattle runoff, wetlands illegally filled, endangered species habitat destroyed. There were emails Bill had obtained through friends who worked in various county offices, showing Marcus Sullivan coordinating with the sheriff and judge to manipulate legal cases and zoning decisions. There were financial records showing suspicious land deals and probable money laundering. It was a roadmap of corruption, and David realized that if he could get this information to the right people, people outside the local system, federal agencies or media outlets or state investigators, he might be able to do what no one had been able to do before. But he also understood that trying to go public with this would paint an enormous target on his back, that the Sullivans would come after him with everything they had, and that he'd need to be very careful and very strategic about how he proceeded. Marcus Littlebear came back after spending Christmas with his family on the reservation, and David showed him the files, and Marcus went very quiet reading through them, especially the parts that involved tribal members who'd worked for the Sullivans or had land dealings with them. "This is huge," Marcus said finally. "This is federal crimes, civil rights violations, environmental crimes, fraud. This could bring them down, but you know they'll fight back. You know they'll try to destroy you before you can get this to anyone who matters." David nodded, said, "I know, but I'm tired of being afraid. I'm tired of watching them get away with it. And I think about my grandfather, about what he'd do, and he'd fight. He'd stand up. He wouldn't let injustice go unchallenged just because it was dangerous." Marcus thought about his own grandfather, about tribal leaders who'd resisted when resistance seemed hopeless, about the long history of his people surviving against impossible odds. And he said, "Okay, I'm with you, whatever you need. But we do this smart. We do this in a way that protects us and maximizes the impact. We find allies. We build a coalition. We go to federal authorities and media simultaneously so they can't suppress it. And we make sure we have everything documented so thoroughly that even the best lawyers can't make it go away." They spent the rest of winter break making copies of everything, creating multiple redundant backups stored in different locations, scanning documents into digital files that were uploaded to secure cloud storage, building a case that could withstand legal challenges. David reached out through his family connections in Sacramento to find lawyers who handled civil rights cases and whistleblower protection, explaining the situation and asking for guidance. Marcus connected with tribal lawyers and advocacy organizations who had experience fighting corruption in areas where indigenous people were exploited. They found a reporter at a Denver newspaper who'd done investigative work on rural corruption and environmental crimes, and they started carefully providing information, building a relationship with someone who could tell the story once they were ready to go public. They were building something bigger than themselves, a coalition that could actually challenge the Sullivan Empire, and the work gave David a sense of purpose and agency that he'd been missing since the camping incident. He wasn't just a victim anymore. He was an investigator, an advocate, someone fighting for justice, not just for himself, but for all the people the Sullivans had hurt over the years. Tyler noticed the change in David when classes resumed in January, noticed that David no longer avoided him or looked away when they crossed paths on campus, noticed something harder in David's eyes, something that looked almost like pity mixed with contempt. It bothered Tyler in a way he couldn't quite articulate, this sense that David knew something Tyler didn't, that the power dynamic had shifted in some way Tyler couldn't see. Tyler's solution, as always when confronted with something that bothered him, was escalation. He started a whisper campaign on campus, spreading rumors that David was involved in dealing drugs, that David had made inappropriate comments to female students, that David had plagiarized his papers, vague accusations designed to poison David's reputation, without leaving Tyler vulnerable to defamation charges. Some people believed the rumors because people generally believe exciting gossip regardless of evidence, but others, people who'd actually interacted with David and seen his character, defended him publicly, and that created a split on campus where you were either Team Tyler or Team David, a polarization that Tyler hadn't intended, but that ended up isolating him more than it isolated David. David had made real friends through his integrity and work ethic, people who knew him and trusted him, while Tyler just had sycophants and hangers-on who were loyal to his money, not his person. And when David started getting defended in social media arguments, Tyler realized he'd miscalculated. That character actually mattered to some people, that his father's money and power couldn't completely control what people thought and said. The crisis point came in February, during a week when Wyoming's legendary wind was howling across the plains, like the earth itself was angry when the temperature dropped to 20 below, and the wind chill made it dangerous to be outside for more than a few minutes. Marcus Sullivan was planning a solo hunting trip, something he did occasionally when he wanted time away from the ranch and the business and his son. A week in the backcountry, where he could pretend to be the rugged individual frontiersman his family mythology claimed his ancestors had been. He was planning to hunt elk in a remote area north of his property, accessed through gates on Sullivan land, an area he'd scouted and hunted for 30 years without incident. Tyler begged to come along, saying he needed to talk to his father about his future and his role in the ranch operations, and Marcus reluctantly agreed, thinking maybe some time in the wilderness would help them connect in a way they couldn't seem to in normal life. They planned to pack in on horseback, set up a base camp, and spend 5 days hunting, just the two of them, without guides or ranch hands. A father-son bonding experience that Marcus hoped might help Tyler mature into someone Marcus could actually respect. They didn't tell anyone their exact location, just left word with the ranch manager that they'd be back the following Sunday, and they rode out on a Monday morning with the wind screaming around them and the horses nervous but manageable, following trails Marcus had used 100 times before. What Marcus Sullivan didn't know was that Bill had provided David with information about Marcus's hunting patterns and favorite locations. Information Bill had gathered over years of selling the Sullivans' gear and listening to their conversations. What Marcus didn't know was that David and Marcus Littlebear had hiked into the same general area 2 days before, setting up their own camp several miles from where they expected the Sullivans would camp, prepared to observe and document any environmental or hunting violations they witnessed, building their case piece by piece. It wasn't harassment or stalking, they told themselves. It was legitimate investigation of someone with a pattern of illegal behavior. And they hadn't planned any confrontation or interference. They were just going to watch from a distance and gather more evidence. But the universe, as it sometimes does, had its own plans that differed from everyone's intentions. Marcus and Tyler Sullivan made their camp in a small clearing near a creek, tied their horses on a high line, and set out to scout the area for elk sign. They found a small herd in a meadow below their camp, and Marcus made a good shot on a mature bull, dropping it cleanly at 200 yards. And they spent the next 2 hours field dressing the animal, a messy, physical process that left them covered in blood and exhausted and satisfied with the work of putting meat on the table the way men had for 10,000 years. The grizzly bear that had been sleeping in a daybed a half-mile away, a large sow who should have been in hibernation but had been disturbed by an early spring thaw and was hungry and irritable, caught the scent of blood and guts on the wind and followed it with single-minded purpose. Because that's what grizzlies do. They follow food smells, especially the overwhelming scent of a fresh gut pile that promises easy calories. David and Marcus Littlebear were glassing from a ridge when they saw the Sullivans' field dressing the elk, watched through binoculars as Marcus Sullivan cut and Tyler held, and they worked together with the kind of practiced efficiency that comes from years of doing something. They watched as the Sullivans stood up, covered in blood, admiring their kill and talking about how to get the meat back to camp. And then they watched in horror as the grizzly emerged from the timber, huge and fast, and completely focused on the gut pile, and the Sullivans didn't see her until she was already on them, until Marcus Sullivan turned around and found himself 15 feet from 600 pounds of predator moving at full speed. Tyler screamed and ran, pure panicked flight response, crashing through the brush toward their camp and their horses. Marcus Sullivan stood his ground for about half a second, tried to bring his rifle up, but the bear was faster, hitting him like a truck hits a deer, driving him to the ground with claws and teeth, tearing through his expensive hunting clothes like they were paper, ripping into his flesh with the same indifference she'd show ripping into the gut pile. Marcus screamed once, a high, terrible sound that carried across the mountains, and then the sound cut off with an awful finality. David and Marcus Littlebear ran down the ridge without discussion or hesitation, running toward danger rather than away, because despite everything, despite all the cruelty and corruption, they couldn't just watch someone die when they might be able to help. They were still half a mile away, crashing through deadfall and brush, their lungs burning in the thin air, when they heard the second scream, briefer than the first, and then silence except for the wind in the pines. They reached the clearing to find Marcus Sullivan's body, partially cached under branches and grass the bear had raked over him, his rifle crushed beside him, his expensive Weatherby rendered useless by the bear's casual violence. His life ended not through human justice, but through the ancient and indifferent justice of nature, protecting her food source and her territory. Tyler was nowhere to be seen, and they could hear crashing in the timber toward the Sullivan camp, could hear Tyler's panicked voice calling for help into a satellite phone that wasn't getting signal in the narrow valley. David approached Marcus Sullivan's body carefully, checking for signs of life, even though the damage was obviously fatal, and he felt a complex mix of emotions he couldn't quite name. This man had enabled cruelty, had created and protected the systems that had harmed David and so many others, had built an empire on exploitation and suffering, but he was also just a person, just another human who'd started as a baby, someone loved, who'd made choices that led him here, and now he was dead in the most primal way possible, killed by an animal that knew nothing of his wealth or power or history. An animal that saw him only as a threat near her food. There was justice in it, but not the justice David had been planning or hoping for. Justice that felt unsatisfying and incomplete, because there was no accountability, no recognition of wrongs, just violence meeting violence and leaving nothing resolved except one man's life. Marcus Little Bear was scanning the tree line, watching for the bear, and he suddenly pointed and whispered urgently, "There, she's still close. We need to get out of here now." David saw the grizzly about 50 yards away, standing on her hind legs to get a better view, checking if these new arrivals were threats or opportunities. She was massive, her winter coat thick and pale, her face scarred from years of dominance fights and hard living, and she was clearly debating whether to defend her cache or retreat. David and Marcus backed away slowly, making themselves non-threatening, talking in low voices the way you're supposed to with bears, and after a long tense minute the sow dropped to all fours and moved off into the timber, leaving her cache for now, but clearly not abandoning it permanently. They found Tyler at the Sullivan camp, hysterical and incoherent, his expensive hunting clothes torn from crashing through brush, his hands shaking so hard he couldn't operate his satellite phone. He looked up at David and Marcus Little Bear with eyes that didn't quite register recognition at first, still lost in trauma, and when he finally focused on them, his expression cycled through confusion, to fear, to anger. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice shaking. "Did you follow us? Did you do this? Did you bring that bear?" And David felt a flash of anger at that, at Tyler's narcissism being so deep that even in crisis he assumed everything was about him, assumed the universe revolved around his conflicts and grievances. "We were camping," David said flatly. "We saw what happened. We tried to get there in time to help. We couldn't. Your father is dead. We need to get out of here before the bear comes back for her cache or gets aggressive about this territory. Where are your horses?" Tyler led them to where the horses were tied, and they could see immediately that one horse had broken his line in panic when he smelled the bear, and he was gone, crashed off into the forest, leaving tracks they could follow but wouldn't catch anytime soon. The remaining horse was terrified, whites showing around his eyes, pulling against the high line, and it took Marcus Little Bear's gentle expertise to calm him enough to load. Tyler kept asking questions, rapid fire and panicked. "What do we do? Do we go back for Dad? Can we carry him out? Should we call the sheriff? What about the bear?" And David made the decision for all of them, the kind of decision someone has to make in crisis, when everyone else is paralyzed by trauma. "We can't move your father without triggering the bear. We can't risk more people dying. We get you to safety. We call this in to authorities who have the equipment and expertise to retrieve a body from an active bear cache. We ride double out to the trailhead. We use your satellite phone to call for help once we're in the open where we might get signal. That's the plan. Get on the horse." Tyler, still in shock, obeyed for maybe the first time in his life, climbing onto the horse behind Marcus Little Bear, while David led them on foot, carrying his pack and some of the Sullivan's gear, following the trail back toward civilization and help and all the questions that would come after. The ride out was long and cold and marked by Tyler's periodic breakdowns, moments where he'd start sobbing or cursing or demanding they go back, and David would talk him through it, using the same calm voice he'd use with a panicked animal, saying they were doing the right thing, saying his father would want him safe, saying they were almost there. They reached the trailhead as darkness fell, and Tyler's satellite phone finally got signal, and David helped him make the call to 911 to report his father's death and the bear attack, to give their location and request help. The sheriff and Fish and Game and Search and Rescue all responded, converging on the trailhead with lights and radios and urgent efficiency, and they found Tyler and David and Marcus Little Bear waiting there, wrapped in emergency blankets from their packs, exhausted and traumatized and alive. The sheriff, Marcus Sullivan's brother-in-law and longtime enabler, looked at David and Marcus Little Bear with immediate suspicion, asking, "What were you two doing in that area? Seems like a hell of a coincidence you being there when this happened." And David, too tired for fear, said, "We were camping. We have permits. We witnessed a tragedy and tried to help. That's all." The sheriff didn't look convinced, but there wasn't much he could do with Tyler right there confirming the basic story, with no evidence of anything except a bear attack in bear country, with the fish and game officer already nodding, and saying this was consistent with grizzly behavior around gut piles, saying Marcus Sullivan had made a classic mistake of not being vigilant enough in active grizzly habitat during hunting season. They spent hours at the sheriff's office that night, giving statements, drawing maps, explaining exactly what they'd seen and done. Tyler was sedated by a doctor and taken home by his aunt, Marcus Sullivan's sister, who arrived with lawyers and fury, demanding to know why the sheriff wasn't arresting someone, anyone, for her brother's death, even though it was clearly a wildlife accident. The fish and game officer explained that they'd mount a retrieval operation at first light, that they'd need to locate and potentially relocate or destroy the bear, depending on her behavior, that this was a tragedy, but not a criminal matter. David and Marcus Little Bear were allowed to leave around midnight, told not to leave town, given the sense that they were suspected of something, even though no one could articulate what that something might be. Mrs. Ortiz was waiting up when David got home, had heard about the Sullivan death through the town grapevine that moved faster than official communication, and she held David while he finally broke down. The adrenaline and shock of the day catching up with him, the sheer surreal horror of watching someone die violently, of being helpless to prevent it, of feeling that complex mix of relief and guilt and horror that comes when someone who's hurt you meets a terrible fate you had nothing to do with causing. The town of Medicine Ridge went into a strange kind of suspended animation after Marcus Sullivan's death, everyone processing the loss of the man who dominated local power structures for 3 decades, everyone suddenly uncertain about the future and what came next. Tyler Sullivan disappeared for a week, staying with relatives in Jackson Hole, attending his father's funeral in a private service David and Marcus Little Bear were pointedly not invited to, even though they'd been the last people besides Tyler to see Marcus alive. The story of the attack spread through the community in the way stories do, getting embellished and distorted, with some people praising David and Marcus for trying to help, and others suspecting them of somehow causing or allowing the tragedy. The town's division over the Sullivans, suddenly forced to confront the fact that their patriarch was gone, and maybe the empire he'd built wasn't as invincible as everyone had assumed. Bill called David into his office at the store and asked him point blank, "Did you have anything to do with that bear being there?" And David looked him in the eye and said, "No, we were observing from a distance, documenting what we could. The bear was just doing what bears do. We had nothing to do with it. We tried to help. That's the truth." And Bill studied David's face for a long moment and then nodded, said, "Okay, I believe you, because I know you, and I know your grandfather taught you honor. But the thing about natural justice is, sometimes it happens on its own timeline. Sometimes the universe doesn't need our help to balance its books. Sometimes we just need to step back and not interfere with what's already in motion." Tyler returned to Medicine Ridge 2 weeks after his father's death, and he was different. Diminished somehow, the swagger and arrogance replaced by something haunted and uncertain. He showed up at the sporting goods store one afternoon when David was working, and Bill almost threw him out, but David said to let him talk. Tyler stood in the camping aisle, surrounded by gear his father had bought from this store, and he said quietly, "I need to ask you something. Did you bring that bear there? Did you do something to make this happen?" And David said, "No. Your father died because he was field dressing an elk in grizzly country without proper vigilance. That's it. No conspiracy, no revenge, just bad luck and wildlife behavior. I'm sorry for your loss. I genuinely am. I wouldn't wish that kind of death on anyone." Tyler looked at him with those haunted eyes and said, "But you must be happy. He protected me, enabled me, helped me do terrible things to you and others. You must be glad he's gone." And David thought about that, about the complexity of feeling multiple things simultaneously, about how justice and tragedy can coexist, about how watching someone's father die violently in front of them changes you regardless of what that father did in life. "I'm not happy," David said finally. "I wanted accountability, not death. I wanted your father to face legal consequences for his crimes, to see the system work the way it's supposed to work. This isn't justice. This is just random violence. And yeah, he hurt a lot of people, but he was also your father, and I'm sorry you had to see that. No one should have to watch their parent die like that." Something broke in Tyler then, some last defense of ego or pride, and he started crying there in the camping aisle. This big entitled kid crying like a child, and David felt no satisfaction in it, just a kind of weary sadness at how much pain gets created when people choose cruelty over compassion, when systems protect the powerful instead of the vulnerable, when wealth and privilege breed the kind of arrogance that destroys everyone it touches. Tyler said through his tears, "I don't know how to be different. My father taught me that power was the only thing that mattered, that people were either wolves or sheep, and you had to be a wolf. But watching him die, watching him just get destroyed by something that didn't care about his power or his money or anything, it made me realize how stupid that all was. We're all just meat to the universe. All the things he thought made him better than everyone else meant nothing when that bear came. And all the things I did to you, to others, those will outlive me now. That's my legacy. Being cruel to people who didn't deserve it, because my father taught me that's what men do." David felt something unexpected then, something like pity mixed with recognition, because Tyler was describing exactly the kind of cycle of abuse and trauma that creates bullies and victimizers, the pattern where hurt people and justify it with philosophies of dominance and power. And David thought about his grandfather again, about breaking cycles, about how strength can be used to protect instead of dominate, and he made a choice. "You can change," David said. "You're 21. Your brain isn't even finished developing. The things you've done were terrible, and you should face accountability for them. But accountability isn't the same as eternal damnation. You can make different choices going forward. You can use whatever you inherit from your father to make amends, to help people, instead of hurting them. You can be a better man than he was." Tyler looked at him with something like desperate hope, like he'd been waiting his whole life for someone to tell him he wasn't destined to be his father, and he said, "How? How do I even start?" And David said, "First, you tell the truth. You go to every person you've hurt, and you apologize sincerely, and you ask what you can do to make amends. Second, you cooperate with any investigations into your father's business practices. You give documents to authorities. You testify honestly. You help expose the corruption so it can be cleaned up. Third, you use your family's wealth to help people instead of controlling them. Scholarship funds for students like Marcus and me. Support for workers' rights and environmental protection. Reparations for people your father screwed over. You can't undo the past, but you can build a different future." The reckoning came faster than anyone expected, with Marcus Sullivan dead and Tyler suddenly cooperative instead of obstructive. The careful investigation David and Marcus Littlebear had been building moved forward rapidly. The Denver Reporter published the first story in early March, a comprehensive expose of the Sullivan Empire's corruption, environmental crimes, and labor exploitation, based on Bill's files and interviews with dozens of former workers and victims, who finally felt safe speaking out with the patriarch gone. The EPA opened an investigation into environmental violations. The FBI started looking at labor trafficking and civil rights violations. The IRS began auditing the Sullivan family finances. The dominoes fell one by one, each revelation triggering more investigations, each investigation exposing more crimes. And suddenly, the protective network of corrupt officials that had enabled the Sullivans for decades started scrambling to save themselves by cooperating with federal authorities. The sheriff resigned rather than face charges of official misconduct and obstruction of justice. The judge recused himself from all Sullivan-related cases and quietly retired when the State Judicial Commission started asking uncomfortable questions. The county attorney, who'd ignored complaints for years, suddenly discovered a pressing need to move to Arizona for his health. Tyler Sullivan, to his credit, cooperated fully, providing documents and testimony that implicated his father in dozens of criminal schemes, basically destroying his father's legacy to build something different from its ruins. He settled with victims out of court, paying real money for injuries and damages his father had caused. Not just token amounts, but life-changing sums that acknowledged the harm done. He established scholarship funds at the community college, specifically for students from marginalized backgrounds, students like David, who needed not just financial help but active support to navigate systems designed to exclude them. He hired a new ranch manager with orders to pay fair wages, follow all regulations, and treat workers with dignity. He reached out to the neighboring ranchers his father had victimized, and offered to sell back land at the prices they'd been forced to accept, giving them a chance to reclaim their legacy. He wasn't perfect, still struggled with his conditioning and privilege, still said tone-deaf things and made mistakes, but he was genuinely trying. And that effort mattered in a way that simple punishment never could have. The girl Tyler had assaulted at the party, the one who'd been threatened into silence, came forward with her story, and Tyler publicly acknowledged what he'd done, apologized without excuses or justifications, and voluntarily entered a diversion program for sexual assault offenders, accepting accountability instead of using his money to dodge consequences. It didn't undo the harm. Nothing could undo the harm. But it was more than most men in his position would ever do, and it created a pathway for healing that pure punishment couldn't provide. David finished his first year at community college with perfect grades, earning recognition as the school's top student and receiving scholarship offers from universities across the region. He stayed in Medicine Ridge through the summer, working full-time at Bill's store, which Bill announced he was selling to David on generous terms. Recognizing that David understood both the business and the values that should guide it, Marcus Littlebear transferred to a 4-year university to study tribal law and advocacy, preparing to go back to his reservation and fight for his people with the skills and knowledge he'd gained. They stayed in touch, these two friends who'd been through trauma together and come out stronger, who'd witnessed both the worst and best of human nature, who understood that justice was something you had to fight for constantly, because it never arrived on its own. Mrs. Ortiz threw David a graduation party that turned into a community celebration. Dozens of people David had met in his year in Medicine Ridge coming to congratulate him and share stories about how his presence and actions had inspired them to demand better from their leaders and institutions. How the exposure of the Sullivan corruption had sparked a broader reckoning with how power operated in their small town. The grizzly bear that killed Marcus Sullivan was never found, had likely returned to her den after the incident and gone into proper hibernation, would emerge in spring to repeat the cycle of survival that had nothing to do with human justice or morality. Fish and game officers did multiple checks of the area and found no signs of habituated or aggressive bear behavior beyond the normal food defense reaction that had caused the tragedy. The bear had simply been a bear, doing bear things, indifferent to the human narratives we construct around natural events. David thought about that bear sometimes, about how she'd become the instrument of a kind of cosmic justice without any intention or awareness, about how Marcus Sullivan had built his empire through domination of nature and people, and had ultimately been killed by nature's indifference to his dominance. There was something circular about it, something that felt more true than satisfying. A reminder that we're all temporary, all vulnerable, all subject to forces we can't control, regardless of how much power we accumulate. Bill retired fully and moved to Arizona with his wife, leaving David to run the sporting goods store with a new vision that emphasized ethical outdoor practices, environmental education, and supporting local conservation efforts. David hired workers from the same marginalized communities the Sullivans had exploited, paying living wages and offering benefits, and treating them like humans deserving of dignity and respect. The store became more than just retail. It became a community hub where people gathered to talk about outdoor ethics, where new residents learned to navigate Wyoming's wilderness safely and respectfully, where the old extractive relationship with nature was challenged and changed. David never forgot his grandfather's teachings about honor and strength, and he passed those lessons on to everyone who worked for him, telling them that real power came from protecting others, not dominating them. That true strength meant controlling yourself, not controlling other people. Tyler Sullivan sold most of the ranch his father had accumulated through corruption and exploitation, keeping only the original family homestead and working it with a small crew on sustainable practices that respected both land and workers. He used the proceeds from the sales to fund the reparations and scholarships he'd promised, and to create environmental restoration projects that began healing some of the damage his family had caused over generations. He attended community college classes alongside students his father would have looked down on, studying environmental science and business ethics, trying to unlearn everything his father had taught him and build new knowledge on a foundation of respect and responsibility. He and David would never be friends exactly. The history was too heavy for that, but they developed a relationship of mutual respect and shared purpose. Two young men who'd been shaped by Marcus Sullivan's cruelty in different ways, and who'd both chosen to break the cycles they'd inherited. The story spread beyond Medicine Ridge in ways David never anticipated. The reporter's articles were picked up nationally, becoming a symbol of how systemic corruption works in rural America, and how it can be challenged when people work together. David was interviewed for podcasts and documentaries, always emphasizing that he wasn't a hero, that he'd just been trying to survive and get an education, that the real heroes were people like Bill and Mrs. Ortiz and Marcus Littlebear, who'd supported him when systems failed. He used the platform to advocate for stronger protections for vulnerable workers, for better enforcement of environmental regulations, for reforms to local justice systems that were too easily corrupted by wealthy interests. He became a voice for the kind of honor and integrity his grandfather had embodied, proving that you could stand up to power without becoming corrupt yourself, that you could fight for justice without sacrificing your values. If you're watching this story wondering what the moral is, what the lesson is supposed to be, here it is. Justice isn't always legal, isn't always neat, isn't always delivered by institutions we trust. Sometimes, justice comes through natural consequences, through the universe's own balancing mechanisms, through the simple fact that power and wealth can't protect you from everything. But that doesn't mean we should wait for natural justice or cosmic karma to handle our problems. Real justice requires people to stand up, to document wrongs, to build coalitions, to work within and outside systems, to create accountability. David Chen could have let Tyler Sullivan drive him out of Medicine Ridge. He could have given up on education, gone back to Sacramento, accepted that wealthy bullies always win. Instead, he stood his ground with dignity and discipline, documented everything, built alliances, and when tragedy struck the Sullivan family through no action of his own, he chose mercy and teaching over revenge and continued cruelty. That's what honor looks like. That's what strength really means. Not dominating others, not getting revenge, not matching cruelty with cruelty, but maintaining your integrity and values even when you have every reason to abandon them, and using whatever power you gain to protect and uplift others rather than to hurt and dominate. Tyler Sullivan could have inherited his father's empire and continued the same patterns of exploitation and abuse. Instead, he faced the trauma of watching his father die violently, recognized the emptiness of everything his father had valued, and made the harder choice to change, to make amends, to build something different from the ruins of his legacy. Redemption isn't easy, isn't automatic, isn't guaranteed, but it's possible if someone genuinely commits to it and accepts accountability for harm done. The people of Medicine Ridge could have continued accepting corruption as normal, as just the way things are, as unchangeable reality. Instead, they found courage when given opportunity, spoke their truths when someone listened, supported investigations when they felt protected to do so, and collectively decided to build better institutions and systems that served everyone, not just the powerful. Change is possible. Justice is possible. But they require people to act with courage and integrity, to support each other, to refuse to accept that cruelty and corruption are inevitable or acceptable. What would you have done in David's position when systems fail, when bullies seem untouchable, when justice seems impossible? Share your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to hear more stories about honor and courage, about ordinary people who stood up to power and refused to back down. Share this story with someone who needs to hear that change is possible, that bullies don't always win, that maintaining your integrity matters, even when it seems like it doesn't. And remember, the greatest strength any of us have isn't physical power or wealth or status. It's the ability to choose who we want to be, to decide what values we'll embody, to protect others instead of dominating them. That's the lesson Marcus Sullivan never learned, and it killed him, figuratively, through the exposure of his corruption, and literally, through nature's indifference to his power. That's the lesson Tyler Sullivan is still learning, painfully and slowly, but genuinely. And that's the lesson David Chen carried with him from his grandfather, the lesson that guided him through trauma and challenge, and ultimately led him to build something good from the wreckage of other people's cruelty. Be like David. Be honorable. Be strong in the way that matters. Use whatever power you have to make the world a little more just, a little more kind, a little more worthy of the best versions of ourselves. I appreciate the detailed structure you've provided, but I need to point out a fundamental incompatibility between your template and the premise. The structure you've outlined is designed for a human conflict story, with bullies, antagonists, corrupt systems, legal justice, and redemption arcs. It requires human villains who can face consequences, make moral choices, and potentially find redemption. However, your premise centers on a fatal bear attack, a natural predator acting on instinct, not a moral agent. A bear cannot be a bully in the traditional sense, cannot face legal justice, cannot have followers or enablers, and cannot experience redemption. The tragedy of a wildlife attack doesn't fit the six-act justice narrative structure you've detailed. Additionally, the premise references what appears to be a real incident, specific date, location, occupation, and manner of death. And I'm not comfortable sensationalizing what may be an actual person's death into entertainment content with hooks, engagement elements, and calls to subscribe. I can offer you two alternatives. Option 1, I write a survival horror story about an oil rig worker and a predatory bear in northern Alberta, but structured as a tense survival narrative rather than a justice story. Option 2, I write a justice narrative following your exact template, but with a different premise that actually fits. Perhaps corruption at an oil rig, where a worker faces off against negligent management, safety violations, or workplace bullying. Which direction would you prefer? I appreciate your detailed creative brief, but I'm not comfortable writing this particular story. The premise you've provided appears to reference a real fatal bear attack in Kamchatka,